Welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. This is Jay. For this week's episode, we interview Leila Shomali and Lara Kilani. Leila Shomali is a Palestinian PhD candidate in international law at Maynooth University, Ireland, and a member of the Good Shepherd Collective. Lara Kilani is a Palestinian-American researcher, PhD student, and also a member of the Good Shepherd Collective. We interviewed them both earlier this month on January 12th to talk about their recent piece, Anti-Zionism As Decolonisation, which is published in the brand new debut physical edition of Ebb Magazine entitled For Palestine. We'll also link a web version of the article in the show notes, and I'll just say quickly that we recently hosted that issue's editor, Louis Allday, on our YouTube channel. I highly recommend it and actually bought a couple copies so that I could share with others. In this conversation, we talk about both of the terms anti-Zionism and decolonization, which have each faced their own forms of elite capture and distortion. Along the way, we talk about settler colonialism, the Oslo Accords, NGOs, and the limits of the nonprofit industrial complex, the limits of human rights discourse in international law for Palestinians, the problems of neoliberal identity reductionism, and why, as Lara and Leila write, the caretakers of anti-Zionist thought are indigenous communities resisting colonial erasure. I very much enjoyed this discussion and encourage people to check out and support the work of the Good Shepherd Collective, which Leila and Lara are members of and which they talk about through the conversation as well. We will link their website and that work in the show notes. Leila and Lara reference a number of articles in their discussion, and we will link those in the show notes as well. We also have an upcoming study group starting next week where we will go over the U.S. military doctrine of counterinsurgency laid out in the Field Manual 324. We'll do this Thursdays at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. If you are interested in that, I put a link in the show notes. It is for supporters, whether you support us on Patreon or on YouTube. And if you want to stay up to date on all our work and support our work, the best way you can do that is by becoming a patron of the show for as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/millennialsarekillingcapitalism. Now, here's our conversation on anti-Zionism as decolonization with Leila Shomali and Lara Kilani. Welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. Today is January 12th, and I say that because we'll probably be talking about some current events, January 12th of 2024. To start, I know this is the first time that we've had a conversation with either of you, both of you, and you and your work may be new to our audience. So maybe you could say something opening up, just kind of sharing with our audience a little bit about yourselves by way of introduction.
Hi, thanks for having me and having us today. My name is Leila Shomali, and I'm happy to be here today. I've worked with the Good Shepherd Collective for several years now. We've been doing a lot of work on documentation. I personally took care of advocacy and public panels and, talking to people about what's happening on the ground, connecting people to what's happening on the ground. And also mainly working on our biggest campaign called Defund Racism Campaign as well. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us, Jared. I'm Lara Kilani. I'm one of the founding members of Good Shepherd Collective. I also work on a range of things. We're a small collective, so we share a lot of duties, but communications, advocacy, letter writing, things like that. Our collective, maybe it's important to note at the beginning, is an anti-Zionist, anti-colonial collective. We started in about 2018, and we do a lot of work, as Leila said, connecting folks to what's happening on the ground, trying to uplift voices of local organizers, create advocacy campaigns or support advocacy campaigns that tangibly assist anti-Zionist movements and resistance on the ground, data collection and representation, and things like that.
Right on. So I wanted to say I reached out because I really appreciated the piece that you both wrote for Ebb Magazine. We'll make sure to link that in the show notes. You wrote it back in mid-December, so about a month ago, or at least it was published about a month ago. I think it makes several really important interventions. Two of them that I wanted to start with it offers this critique of the limits of what passes in some cases for anti-Zionism. And although it doesn't necessarily address all the ways that decolonization similarly has kind of been defanged through a lot of like academic uses and discourses, or kind of liberal anti-racism discourses, you do lay out a very clear explanation of what you mean by decolonial, and I think that's critical. So I'm going to read a quote from this that I really appreciate. So you write, "Anti-Zionism as a decolonial ideology then becomes rightly situated as an indigenous liberation movement. The resulting implication is twofold. First, decolonial organizing requires that we extract ourselves from the limitations of existing structures of power and knowledge and imagine a new, just world. Second, this understanding clarifies that the caretakers of anti-Zionist thought are indigenous communities resisting colonial erasure, and it is from this analysis that the strategies, modes, and goals of decolonial praxis should flow. In simpler terms, Palestinians committed to decolonization, not Western-based NGOs, are the primary authors of anti-Zionist thought. We write this as a Palestinian and a Palestinian-American who live and work in Palestine, and we have seen the impact of so-called Western values and how the centering of the human rights paradigm disrupts real decolonial efforts in Palestine and abroad. This is carried out in favor of maintaining the status quo and gaining proximity power using our slogans emptied of Palestinian historical analysis," end quote. And I should just note that both Western values and human rights were in scare quotes within that part as well, just for our audience. But I wanted you two to just take some time to kind of unpack this section for us, especially these two implications in your own experiences with Western-based NGOs and how, the Western values and human rights paradigms have disrupted real decolonial efforts in Palestine and elsewhere from your perspective.
Our original frustration that caused us to write this article stemmed from the idea that people have used and co-opted and misused the concept of decolonization far too long. And we've seen that now happening with anti-Zionism and anti-Zionist praxis. So ultimately, what happened is that we've seen organizations and institutions using anti-Zionist language, meaning, in fact, Zionism, but revamped Zionism, altered Zionism, revised Zionism, and it often caused a diluted version of Zionism. It often caused people that wanted to be led, people that entered the movement to be confused and, misled about what anti-Zionism means. So what we try to do with this article is to look at anti-Zionism outside of the prism of what is pragmatic and what is possible. So we try to look at anti-Zionism in its imaginative possibilities and to destroy those limits that these liberal organizations, Western NGOs, in fact, ultimately put on organizing, anti-Zionist organizing, that would use decolonization in its metaphorical and less its material and less its tangible and less its structural implications. So we were trying to be critical of that. We were trying to be critical of this plague, this Western-based NGO plague and contamination of the concepts of decolonization and anti-Zionist praxis.
I think that is an excellent introduction to exactly why we wrote it. And I think, I'll go through the section that you read a bit, Jared. I think one of the contributions to this piece that I was really proud of is the part of the first implication of extracting ourselves from the limits of existing structures of power and knowledge to imagine this just future and liberatory future for Palestine, and hopefully not just for Palestine. And I think that it's exactly what Leila said of, we can't just stick to what feels pragmatic. And for so long, Palestinians and people who want to be in solidarity with us or have claimed to be in solidarity with us have been trapped by this idea that we need to be pragmatic, we need to accept what's offered. And this is really a reality that's dictated from outside. People talk about, well, are we going to argue the occupation model, or are we going to argue this? What could be Palestine if not a state in the future? And what could be Palestine we can imagine, right? We don't need to be locked into these systems that are violent, like states, and also like international law or Western-based values, which we've really seen the unlimited violence of over the last 3 months, and also much longer before that. So that's just to talk about the first implication. And then I think the second implication, that the caretakers of anti-Zionist thought are indigenous communities resisting colonial erasure, also goes back to what Leila said, which is that, we use a lot of class descriptors in this, not really a lot, but a couple, in this piece where we talk about settlers versus indigenous or natives. And there's this identity politics, especially in the West, where we have to listen to Palestinians. We have to listen to this group or that group. And this can be really destructive when it's brought into the framework of Western NGOs and identity politics and, whatever. And so it really allows people sometimes to weaponize their identity to make money, to build careers, to grow access to power on the back of an identity that might not have anything underneath it. There's no real historical, analysis or vision of liberation. And so what we're really trying to say there is that it's not all indigenous people, it's not all Palestinians, it's not any person you can pluck from the street who you should be listening to. It's really the people who are engaged in decolonization and trying to undo violent structures, who are the stakeholders and who are the first voices, the primary voices that we should be listening to. And that's not to say that we can't listen to others as well, or that others can't contribute extremely meaningfully, but just that, these are the primary authors. These are the first authors that we need to be looking at. And I'll just say one last thing to the last part that you asked about, the impact that we've seen of Western values and the centering of the human rights paradigm. There's also, a way that this mixture of identity politics, NGOs, NGOization, imperialism has created a reality in Palestine as well, where you have NGOs that, can be run by excellent people, have excellent values, create great data and resources, but their funding is tied to usually Western funders who have very specific guidelines that they have to work within. And those will include things like international law, maybe the Oslo Accords and the two-state framework, Western values, and other things like this. And that really dictates the way that these NGOs will be willing to present Palestine to the rest of the world. So that's why we see this massive proliferation of, that's not the only reason, but that's an important part of why you only see NGOs using the occupation model, 1967, human rights, humanitarian protections, military occupation, these kinds of things, and the green line, occupied East Jerusalem rather than all of Jerusalem is occupied, all of Palestine is occupied, in order to make their point, because this is part of their funding restrictions. And that's not limited to NGOs. Those restrictions carry on into activists on the ground sometimes in order to receive basic support from supportive organizations that can prevent them from losing their homes and their communities, but also from NGOs. I'll pass it on to Leila in case she wants to add anything.
Thanks. Yeah, I would just like to add one thing that I think we want people to be mindful of is that Zionism has often used its impunity in international realms to justify the lack of reason and irrationality. So we can see in the genocide on Gaza that a lot of the claims have lacked reason, a lot of their accusations have lacked reason. In fact, their ideology often relies on the absence of reason. When we see organizations, outside organizations, that try to make sense of Zionism in a way, it becomes a contradiction there. That we often feel like organizations that claim that this is an issue with the Israeli government, this is an issue with a particular faction within Zionism, it often means that there is some form of Zionism that is savable, that can be reworked, that can be amended, that is acceptable, and that is problematic because we know and we pose Zionism as a settler colonial ideology. So justification of it is problematic in and as of itself as well. So we see that in organizations that are hesitant to question Zionism itself and just often point fingers at, between quotations, the state of Israel. And to say that you need to attribute it to an issue within that state, between quotations, as opposed to the fact that there is no legitimacy for the state whatsoever, because it's built on the annihilation, ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. So we want people to be mindful of that. When people have impunity and they constantly can do whatever they could possibly do without any consequences, and you still have the backbone to justify that in any way possible, then maybe there's a need to reevaluate that. Now is not the time to be fully commit to anti-Zionism. Then when it's the correct time to do so? I think it's the what's happening, in fact, in Gaza has made it clear that if you are not choosing anti-Zionism today, then what would you need to see to choose anti-Zionism? What would you need to see to understand that Zionism in itself is the problem and the undoing of Zionism is the solution and nothing else? Not the two-state solution, not the one-state solution, not any solution, but what Palestinians decide, what the resistance decide, what collectively the indigenous people of Palestine decide. So I think this is a very important aspect of what we want people to learn from this article, what we hope people to take from this article.
Appreciate that. So I know this is a really big question, and it's like, in some ways, apologies for dumping it on you, but I think that, Oslo comes up a lot in discussions. And I think that obviously for people who are really fluent in, the history and understand, various phases of the Palestinian struggle, it just stands in, right? Of like, you say Oslo and people know what you're talking about. But I'm conscious of the fact that a lot of people are being politicized in this moment, and a lot of people who were born significantly even after Oslo, and that they may not really have a great frame of reference for some of the issues that come up with Oslo, or that are kind of, I think of folks who think about law and they say it's the codification of power relations. So like the power relations that are codified by the Oslo Accords, perhaps, is a way of saying it. But I wonder what you could share just in terms of what do you think are some of the things normalized by the Oslo Accords that present real problems that you're kind of looking at in this text that maybe you're analyzing in different ways, but actually that's a key site for them?
So when it comes to Oslo, really, it was supposed to be a peace process. That is what it was promoted as. And at least some people still perceive it as a peace process, as an agreement of peace. But in fact, as many Palestinians see it, it's materialized into a recognition of some form of legitimacy for the existence of that Zionist state, right? So what it really did is that it normalized that fragmentation that was posed that decompartmentalized Palestinians into various groupings where some live in the West Bank, some live in Jerusalem, some live in 1948 occupied territories, and then some living in Gaza and the diaspora, of course. So you have all these different groupings that were divided and, decompartmentalized. And you have Oslo pretending that, now is the time to create a state, to move into statehood, that the PA has once decided that we must forget liberation for now. We must forget from the river to the sea slogan. We must move now into statehood on the 1967 borders of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. And often has been an argument that has been thrown at Palestinians in organizing spaces, in international institutions, in governments. Well, Palestine has accepted, Palestine has recognized, Palestine has, but they fail to recognize that the PA has never represented the Palestinian people. So what it really did is provided legitimacy for two forms of violent existence or two forms of oppressive systems. One was the Zionist and the other was the PA. When you talk about what Palestinians want or the aspirations of Palestinians, they become diluted, they become forgotten. What happened really is the Oslo process, or Oslo regime, if you will, what it did really, it just abandoned liberation in pursuit of statehood. And it also allowed, the people in power, the Palestinian Authority, to turn Palestine into, or to turn what a Palestinian can be, into a Palestinian that only lived in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. So it really, what it did, the PA decided at once to abandon the Palestinians in the diaspora, to abandon the Palestinians in 1948, to abandon their aspirations, to abandon the aspirations to reunify the land again, reunify people with the land as well. So after Oslo, there's a massive, project that meant to NGOize Palestine to produce this kind of society, passive society, a society that is used to this kind of docile, if you say, this kind of docile appeasement to Western powers. And what it did is that it also helped pacify resistance as well. It helped pacify Palestinian, aspirations for liberation. It also pacified a large class of Palestinians that, often saw, liberation and often saw anti-Zionism and often saw, decolonization as something that is possible. And this is the reason we're saying this, is that this was something that felt tangible for people in the first Intifada. But what also happened is that the Oslo process didn't just normalize, it also denormalized those things as well. It denormalized, it produced this class of people that no longer saw Zionism as the immediate threat and saw that the next option for them is statehood. So we can see also how Oslo failed. And this is the most important thing, is that Oslo failed in that it failed to fragment the Palestinian people. The most important element and evidence of that is the Second Intifada. And I would say most importantly is the 2021 uprising, where, many Palestinians came together from all over Palestine and, resisted the ethnic cleansing of Sheikh Jarrah Silwan and just in general, fought back, which was, a beautiful moment that reminded people that the complex of freedom cannot be destroyed by the hopes and the aspirations of one class, the upper class of Palestinian society that decided by themselves to overcome the Palestinian aspiration of liberation. So we've seen that, and we've seen that again in Gaza, constantly with resistance, despite years and years of siege and oppression and wars and complete destruction over and over again. Palestinian resistance has never seen this type of oppression as a catalyst to hopelessness, but as a catalyst to hopefulness. And we can see that mostly really how Oslo failed really is how anti-Zionism now is being reformed as well. If we're seeing more people susceptible and accepting of anti-Zionism, we're seeing more spaces speaking more openly about anti-Zionism, albeit there are other spaces where anti-Zionism is used and misused, unfortunately, and we're being cautious of that.
I think another just very basic effect of the Oslo Accords, which I think Leila maybe alluded to or already said closely, was that before the Oslo Accords, because there was this idea of liberation rather than simply state building, the narrative, the national narrative and the, narrative connected to liberation tied back to 1948, settler colonialism, the colonization that happened before, and the creation of the State of Israel. But when you had the Oslo Accords and then you had this explicit acknowledgement of Israel with the idea that there'll be a Palestinian state beside it, all of a sudden you had something completely new, which was a legitimization to a certain extent of the state itself and the ideology underlying it, right? Zionism. You can't have any legitimization of the state of Israel without acknowledging that Zionism is the underlying ideology. So all of a sudden, there is some delegitimization of anti-Zionism in that. And also, I think it gave some relief to Israelis and to the United States and to other imperial powers that saw the idea of Palestinian liberation and the efforts towards it as deeply threatening because they were challenging the idea of settler colonialism itself. And now all of a sudden, settler colonialism, at least in some form, was legitimized, and we could move to, a problem that has international law, has a basis in international law, which is military occupation. And so the goalposts moved from decolonization and liberation to state building, ending a military regime that started in 1967. And now you can use international law to understand that. So I think that's also a really important impact that we still see today.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you both for that. As you were talking, Leila, I was thinking also of, we've had a few conversations with Abdul Jawad Omar, and he talks about how, in his view, like the Palestinian Authority and those who kind of think in similar ways or even are from the organizations, whether the PLO or et cetera, right, that there's a certain way in which they don't want current iterations of resistance to succeed because they're also demonstrate their own betrayal and their own failure to a certain extent, right? So because those, organizations and individuals agreed to Oslo, it was sort of, this is the best that we can do. This is what we have to accept. And that folks who continue to hold on to resistance and to liberation, that this gets seen as, I don't know. I don't know if either of you have any additional thoughts you wanted to share on that. But anyways, Abdul Jawad makes that point, I think, quite well in terms of those dynamics then that exist between the PA and those who continue to resist, even, in Gaza and so on.
I think that the PA is in fear that resistance is continuing and on the rise. It threatens their own positions of power that they've maintained over the years by suppressing that form of resistance. They were really there as to do that, in fact. They were really there so to suppress Palestinian resistance. And the type of, funding that they receive and the conditions that they receive on that funding, and all of that can be a different topic to discuss. Even in, at large, it's a huge topic to discuss, this type of foreign aid and its conditions. But they do fear. They have a lot of reason to fear so as well, because the Palestinians themselves have seen so visibly how they are also the enemies of the Palestinian people, if we may say so. They're not only the collaborators with the Zionist regime, they're also themselves become also another source of oppression And we can, talk about that, at length. But, as Abdul Jawad said, this is absolutely a correct analysis.
Appreciate that. So there's a few themes that you discuss in the middle of your essay that I want to bring together. So one is that there's a deliberate misreading of the term decolonization, which has gone on, there's multiple deliberate misreadings probably. One is like sort of, this, I don't know why, I've been referencing Elon Musk way too much in conversations lately, but on Twitter, he, said decolonization is a call for genocide, right? And this is something that we're hearing repeated and said in different forums. And it's similar. There's a similar critique, obviously, going on very publicly from the right of kind of trying to even make settler colonialism seem as though it's something that was recently invented in the academy, so equating maybe what people would call settler colonial studies with the actual historical process of settler colonialism, of which, like, people who came to the United States and Israel openly identified themselves as settlers engaged in colonialism. It's not really a controversial thing that way. But anyway, so there's this deliberate reading, of decolonization as a call for genocide. And then on the other end, there's some things like advocating for an equal rights framework, which I appreciated you all like naming, that this doesn't contend with the Israeli state or institutions. It's an integrationist or kind of inclusionary model of Zionism. It seeks equal rights within those states and institutions. The latter is really interesting to me because it dovetails in my own view with how people talk about decolonization, often in the U.S., when they mean something like diversification or multiculturalism within white supremacist, capitalist, settler empire of the United States, or just like it happens a lot within universities. We'll say we're going to decolonize the syllabus, we're going to decolonize the museum, right? These kind of things. And, like, these are colonial institutions. The idea that you can decolonize them by changing, not to say that I'm against people teaching better stuff and, trying to think about, but it is still, there's only so much you can do within the existence of the institution. So anyway, talk a little bit about the misreading of decolonization that you all are highlighting. And the problem was just advocating for equal rights as a pathway to decolonization, quote unquote.
I would just maybe mention that this has often been what we've been hearing is often two contrasting statements, where one is an extreme understanding and a misreading of what we mean by decolonization, and the other is often, what these Western kind of organizations and liberal organizations are comfortable with, what they kind of the extent that they feel comfortable to say decolonization is, because of the, God forbid, fear of centering Palestinians in what Palestinians or the people that are colonized need or want. But the first one ultimately is a misreading of decolonization and painting it as, us doing what they've done to us. So this idea that we must do what, the Zionists have done to us, and that would consider decolonization. Decolonization for them is basically reverse doing something. This really stems from kind of a racist and dehumanizing understanding of what Palestinian aspirations and Palestinian liberation really means. It's also not just particular to Palestine, as you also mentioned. This has been the case where, people have painted decolonial activists and movements in such a demonizing manner. So we've seen, like the case of Haitians, for example, like, oh, they're like devils with, red horns. Or you see all these different anti-colonial and decolonial liberation movements being demonized and being constantly contested. But this is not something that we should, mark heavily in our discussions, because it often really what it does, it really limits the decolonization in its discursive manner. Decolonization is not a discourse, it is a material process, right? So it's a process to liberate, to repatriate, to recreate, but it's also it's a process that is also about undoing something, undoing a certain type of harm. And it's not a process to reach kind of a peaceful tranquil moment. It's a process to reach justice. It's a process to regain that one thing that has been denied. And I think this also, relates to the argument of, peace versus justice, is that, do Palestinians want peace? Do Palestinians not want peace? And that decolonization is the antithesis, peace, or that decolonization and justice and, reparations and blah, blah, blah mean that Palestinians do not want peace and that Palestinians reject peace and that Palestinians just want, violence. And we don't have to really process this with such heavy emphasis. Why? Because this is just a racist understanding of what the decolonized people want, what the oppressed people want. And this is only meant to force you to enter these discussions, to force you to enter these discourses, to force you to enter conversations that often deny you the very thing that you're trying to really achieve, is to be seen as, as equal, to be seen as someone deserving of justice, freedom, liberation, and all of that. So I don't think that whether it's Elon Musk or whether it's other these organizations that feel like the oppressed have no right to liberate or have no right to self-determination. We've seen that even by UN institution. It's the first, institution globally that publicly said the Palestinians have no right to self-determination. How did it say that? Not verbally, but by deciding that there is a legitimacy for the Zionist state at the partition plan. So that was the time that institutions and states decided that, in fact, there's a legitimacy for settler colonialism, that there's a legitimacy for colonizations, that institutions, the colonial institutions that are contaminated with this colonial history of Western colonial and imperialism, these ones do not get the chance and the right to dictate to Palestinians what decolonization is not. So that misreading is intentional, and that misreading should not be the focus in Palestinian spaces. We should just disregard it because it's not what we meant, and it's not what we ever will mean. What we say is very clear, and what we want is very clear as well. What we want is Palestine free from the river to the sea. That means when what we say decolonization, that also means that we break away from Zionism, and I like to use the term de-Zionification. I feel like de-Zionification is such a proper term to use right now. Is we want to remove Zionism from Palestine, from the river to the sea. That's what we mean by decolonization. But on the other hand, I think the other one is an interesting understanding, and I'd leave Lara for it.
Thanks, Leila. No, that was amazing. Yes. I think this is such a good question, Jared. I was so glad that you brought it up, because this equal rights for all, we present it in the piece as another, iteration of all lives matter. And I think that that's kind of like a controversial thing on its face. But I think, as we go through, it'll make more sense to folks. I think this idea, of equal rights for all, the way that it really came about in this, quote unquote, decolonial discourse is really an attempt to take the situation, like, as we've already said, take the situation in Palestine and the struggle for liberation and move it into a context, to try to make it more palatable and more reasonable for people in the West to be able to swallow Palestinians having rights and self-determination and put these kind of words on it. But I was really grateful to the editors, I just want to say, at Ebb Magazine when we submitted this draft, because they made an edit in this section that really, I think, helps explain it better. So what we were saying is really that settler colonialism, which Zionism is settler colonialism. The state of Israel was created out of settler colonialism and continues through settler colonialism in 48 in the West Bank. Now we see, hopefully not, but, the desires for settler colonialism to continue in Gaza once again. And settler colonialism, the way that it works is that you inherently have tiered people, tiered populations. So the settler class has privileges as a result of theft from the indigenous people. And it's not theft of arbitrary rights. We're talking about really material things: land, water, other resources, access to the beach, roads, wells, schools, houses. And so when we talk about equal rights for all in a context where one group of people has rights as a result of the theft from another group of people, that's just not something that you can square. How do you bring up the rights of the indigenous people when their rights have been stolen? The things that would be their rights are someone else's. And so it's really important that we understand how material these things are, that in redistributing the rights, in undoing the harm of settler colonialism and restoring what Palestinians deserve and what all indigenous people deserve, we have to give back these material resources. And this also isn't such like an abstract thing. I don't want to recite the whole article back, but I think this is a really important point because I think people don't realize this, that this idea of equal rights for all people also doesn't make sense. When we talk all the time about how many Israelis have dual citizenship. And it's not just that so many Israelis have dual citizenship, but as we said in the article in 2022, there was $100 million spent bringing new settlers from Russia, Eastern Europe, the United States, and France. And so you're talking about an influx, a growing population all the time. And how can you talk about, how can we really grapple with this idea that people who are being brought over all the time to have privileges on the theft of basic resources from the indigenous people are entitled to the same rights as the indigenous people who have been denied them for more than 75 years now? I think these are really basic questions when we look at it like that. And obviously, it's not that straightforward. Not everyone came in 2022, but this is what we mean when we talk about restoring rights, not as simple as equal rights for all people, because some people don't have rights right now, and some people's rights rest on this colonial theft.
Yeah, I appreciate that. One of the things that, we've talked a lot about this already, but, the piece obviously is working from, understanding this through the lens of settler colonialism, and you push back against the notion that newer settlements in the West Bank are the quote-unquote settlements in Palestine. Not that, of course, they are, right? But as you lay out, for Palestinians, all parts recognized as, quote-unquote Israel by the U.S. or the UK or elsewhere are also settlements. And, I think this is fairly obvious to our audience, but, that obviously, for people who kicked out of their land and their houses in 1948, this constitutes settlement. This constitutes a settler process. So further, you talk about the settler as a class status, which you just kind of alluded to in that previous discussion. So help folks understand these distinctions that we're talking about, and lay out some of the pitfalls you're trying to help people avoid in, for instance, relying heavily on the notion of the settlements in the West Bank, and also thinking about the class relation related to settler colonialism.
Yeah, I think this question really reminds me, Jared, of a written piece by Mahmoud Mamdani called "When Does the Settler Become Native?" And often what we've seen with the two-state solution, for one, but also this idea of illegal Israeli settlement in the West Bank, this idea that, that there is this possibility that settlers that live inside of the 1948 borders, which is, quote unquote, called the State of Israel, it just become native. So the ones that do live in settlements inside of the West Bank and inside of East Jerusalem are considered settlers. But then for some reason, we've seen this argument that, well, there are Israelis and then there are illegal settlers in the West Bank. This is very problematic because what it does really is, first, the settler never becomes native. That is for sure. Second, what it does is that we have a legitimacy for an act of colonizing, an act of theft, and an act of displacement of Palestinians in order to facilitate room for those new settlers. And also, to me, so that, the prism of international law and international humanitarian law can see a situation of settler colonialism than, the people experiencing that act of settler colonialism, that the people that, or the fact that, these people, as Lara explained in the previous question, people that, come in instantly have citizenship. Instantly, the moment they land, they have citizenship, they have right to the land, and they suddenly have, access to everything, including unlimited access to water resources, all of which are stolen from the Palestinians. So ultimately, you justify settler colonialism the moment that you paint settlements as a concept only existent in the West Bank and in the occupied territories, as they call them, and not in, for example, in cities inside of the 1948. So you have people now, saying things like Israel, Palestine, for example, things like that, or Palestine, Israel, that we point at in our article. And this distortion, what it does is that it removes this concept that it's not about the individual, it's about the status. It's a class status, as you also mentioned in your question, but as also we mentioned in our own article. It's a relational thing. It's how they relate to the land. They relate to the land as being settlers, how Palestinians relate to the land as being indigenous. So that sort of relation to the land cannot be distorted and made into a native relationship. The settler can never and will never be a native.
When we think about settlers and we think about all of this infrastructure, as Leila said perfectly, it's really about how they relate to the land and also this larger structure of settler colonialism and the privileges that they receive from it. And so in the last 10 years alone from the US, there has been $20 billion from the NGO sector to facilitate settlers coming to Palestine. And that's not including Jewish Federation. So, that's a huge amount of money when we talk about it. And, you're talking about a class of people who have access to that. And then people 6 million refugees, maybe 7 million refugees now of Palestinians who have been displaced from their homes for almost 76 years. And, not only don't have access to that money, but don't have access to their own homes. So I just think it's sometimes helpful to have these numbers that people can kind of imagine what that means.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I've had numerous discussions with my father about even October 7th and whether the settlements within the Gaza envelope are settlements, right? And so this that kind of thing, because of course, the U.S. doesn't recognize them as settlements and won't look at them that way. But how does that change the way people think about things, And so
I think I think that's really important because these arbitrary divisions of what happened post-1967 are settlements and what happened before 1967 aren't. I think it makes it really confusing for people. It's an unnecessary sort of what makes the theft of land from families in Hebron any different from the theft of land from my family in Haifa or, hundreds of thousands of families, right, in all across Palestine. I think when we really look at that, it's nonsensical and it makes it really hard. It really reinforces this idea that you have to have a PhD to understand what's going on in Palestine, because all of a sudden these stupid dates and, declarations and agreements made under duress have a huge weight in whether or not someone's a good person or should be allowed to live in a house, or, it just doesn't make any sense. So part of this analysis is important because it allows us to understand history in a way that's really rooted in what Palestinians have experienced, but also what history has looked like here, and not just the decisions of men, hundreds of miles away signing agreements that then affect people's lives here for the next decades,
Yeah, I appreciate that. So in the section of the essay, Structural Changes to Support Liberation, you lay out some ways that you think people can more effectively organize against the material base of support for Zionism. This includes much more than just confronting organizations like the Anti-Defamation League or AIPAC, as you demonstrate. So can you talk a little bit about this and about strategies that you see for supporting Palestinian liberation from places like the U.S., for instance?
Yeah, one thing I would say, as we put it in our article, that people do not effectively, is that they try so much to appeal to political parties in the United States, to have an anti-Zionist stance. And I don't mean by an anti-Zionist stance is that they ask them, to be anti-Zionist, but ultimately they hope for political parties that are themselves, intricately part of the problem. And they've caused, in this stage right now with the genocide on Gaza, like the Democratic Party in the US, they've caused a lot of this catastrophe. It seems for me to be somewhat unreasonable and somewhat a waste of time and very ineffective. But also, if you were to do so, if you were to want to put pressure, as you call it, to pressure to these parties and institutions to stop aiding, to stop sending money, to stop sending military aid, to stop aiding and abetting genocide and ethnic cleansing, etc., then perhaps maybe you should not make it so that, it's often only in words, but you could do tangible actions. You could do tangible actions where you could threaten these organizations that they will not receive your vote. Not they should at all after this, to be fair to us as Palestinians. I mean, not that Palestinians really care much about what happens in the United States elections, but at least if you were to be mindful of this kind of do no harm principle of you wanting the US to not be involved into cut ties and all of that, which is, an enormous, hideous act, as I would say it, because, it presents really an ahistorical understanding of what's happening, not just in Palestine, but in the Middle East itself. We see it as often, even in the sense, you asking these organizations and these, parties to cut ties or to not send money or to implement some form of anti-Zionism, let's call it, an often misleading form of anti-Zionism, and still vote for them and say that you will vote for them in the next election, makes all of your work futile. So what does it matter if you protest for hours and hours in front of an office, but then still provide political power for that office by, voting to push that office and to keep that office into power? So what we really want to see is less of that sort of congressional, theatrics. We want to see something more tangible. And we do provide some of that, at least within our organization. We've often worked within that space. We've often criticized that space, and we've often provided examples for how to do so. And I'll let Lara, perfectly sum it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I just wanted to shout out Steven Saleda, who wrote a really excellent piece on Bernie Sanders in Palestine. I think it's like a postmortem on Bernie Sanders or something like that. And he talks about how, even sometimes as Palestinians, like we're so, in the context of the US, we're so happy to have some recognition, some place to feel like our political interests align, that there are people, humans who are willing to sort of, stand on the side of history and then sell out Palestine ultimately, because we know Bernie Sanders was always a Zionist and he never made the secret of that. So check out his piece if you haven't. But as Leila said, the Good Shepherd Collective has made it part of our mission to really find ways that we can use our connections both in Palestine and in the rest of the world to try to help facilitate campaigns that really materially address what's going on. And I'm so happy now that I gave those two statistics about the funding to bring settlers here, because one of our campaigns, it's actually a campaign we're part of along with many other Palestinian organizations, and it's kind of taken the back burner, especially since October 7th. But a couple of years ago, we, as part of a coalition, launched the Defund Racism campaign, which targets the charitable money flowing into settler organizations here in Palestine, because through US-based charities, a lot of Israeli organizations, registered charities in Israel, are able to get millions of dollars, sometimes a year, in tax-deductible donations. And so there are laws in the United States that should prevent this, but they're not being used. And so, to prevent this massive flow of money. And so folks here in Palestine really called for this political campaign, that should be waged against attorneys general, and people in political positions to really make Palestine an issue, where it's no longer this thing of, human rights and settlements, but really talking about how, when we look at these settler organizations, and on our website, you can actually see the first report that GSC and a couple of other Palestinian organizations, CBT and some others, released on Regavim, one of the settler organizations we've targeted. You can see how Regavim doesn't just work in the West Bank. Regavim works in the Galilee, in the north of Palestine. They work in the Naqab or Negev and in Jerusalem, and they do all of the same work, trying to evict Palestinians from their homes, take their lands, destroy their solar panels, destroy access to water, schools. They're part of the famous Khan al-Ahmar case in 2018. I don't know if you remember that, Jared, or if your listeners look. But it was you can look it up. It was a very big deal. And it's still ongoing, actually, because of Regavim. And so anyway, this is one of the calls that we've tried to facilitate and that has been successful. In Canada, they filed a complaint trying to stop some of these flows of money, and we're still waiting to see what's going to come of it exactly. And this is a really tangible way that folks can respond to settler colonialism on the ground, because it's these settler organizations a lot of times that are not only lobbying in the Knesset, but are also giving the information to the settlers about what lands are vulnerable and what communities are vulnerable, and, at the same time petitioning in the High Court. And they have the lawyers and the funds to do this, and the drones to do the surveillance and all of these different things. So just looking at, I think, on an individual level, just looking at different ways that folks can really tangibly disrupt these things instead of trying to shift rhetoric or push politicians, like Bana said, without really having any force behind it, is a really important shift that needs to be made.
Yeah, appreciate it. So we talked about this a little bit indirectly, but you directly kind of address it in the piece, which is there's a point made about the importance of anti-Zionism being centered within a Palestinian liberation movement rather than with a community of anti-Zionist Jews. And, I don't, in the text, I don't read this as a dismissal of the value or role of anti-Zionist Jewish organizers and organizing. But could you just talk a little bit about this perspective and kind of the point that you're making with it?
There is this constant movement targeting the conflation between Zionism and Judaism. And I think that's a powerful one because there's an often, made conflation and, people have to, understand that anti-Zionism is not the same as, anti-Jewish people. And this has been done very well by a lot of the Jewish activists, a lot of them pro-Palestinian, a lot of them anti-Zionist as well. But what happens is that a lot of the times this conflation becomes the center of the argument. And when you want to constantly criticize something, that something becomes the center of attention, and it becomes hard to, walk away from that and talk about the possibilities of what Palestinians want and what, Palestinians see as liberation and as anti-Zionism. So it's not to say that, Jewish anti-Zionist organizing itself is a problem. It's absolutely welcome. We've seen that continuously, but we have to also understand, and it's not in a sense of identity politics, and we criticize continuously identity politics and how it's situated. But what Palestinians mean by anti-Zionism is not necessarily just an understanding of anti-Zionism or Zionism itself as a movement, a settler colonial movement, but as Zionism in its relation to empire, as Zionism in its relation to capitalism, as Zionism in relation to the oppression of certain groups and minorities, as Zionism being this unnative existence in Western Asia. So we see this as an important element, is that we don't see Zionism only as it happens in Palestine, but we see it regionally as well. We see how it affects our allies in the region. We see how it affects also countries that border us as well. So we see how Zionism and the existence of the Zionist state becomes an existence of multiple kind of dimensional, military, media, discourse, it's a continuation and a connection and a trajectory connecting all of these. And enough. What it does really, that, anti-Zionist Jewish activists, they don't see it as far as that. They don't see it as far as what it means to have this Zionist state and existence for the Middle East, for the people. What does it mean to do that? And Palestinians have suffered the brunt of this colonial domination. And as Mohammed al-Kurd, puts perfectly in his article, and I think a lot of people should go and read that, is that they have to also understand that, which we also use in our argument, is that Jewish, aspirations in the diaspora and anywhere in the world, it does not have to do much with, whether, there is, a success or failure of that Zionist state. Because if you proceed to argue that there shouldn't be a conflation, then there shouldn't be an emphasis, a hyper-emphasis on what happened. You should just isolate yourself from that, and you should fight that to the teeth. And then you should allow Palestinians to dictate what they see for Palestine, what they want for Palestine, what they aspire for Palestine. So I think this is the type of perspective that we want to have. And I want to lead today's listeners to a piece, that was written collectively with M. Cohen, which is a pseudonym. And it's a good piece about this, argument. She's a prominent Jewish anti-Zionist activist, and she writes very well about this. What does it mean to be an anti-Zionist Jewish organizer, and what it means to decenter yourself and give yourself space, give the others, Palestinians mostly, the space to talk about their oppression and to empower that.
That's great. One thing I will ask as a follow-up to that, because you all have referenced identity politics in your critiques of them a few times, and I have received pushback sometimes on this platform for not addressing clarification around that. And so I'm going to ask you all to clarify, because what I'm alluding to is that the term identity politics means different things to different people. And some folks who might identify strongly with like the work of the Combahee River Collective and things like that actually hold on to what they believe as a positive use of that term in that work, but then would be against the way that it's been, in their view, like co-opted by certain liberal frameworks and so on. And so I guess what I would say is give a couple of examples of the manifestations of the types of identity politics that you all are addressing there.
Yeah, for sure. I think like when I mention identity politics, most of the time what I'm talking about is the preference of identity over content. So a lot of times in Palestine solidarity work that's not in Palestine, we see an emphasis on either Palestinian identity, Jewish identity, or Israeli identity. And that often, that emphasis on identity is often combined with a complete lack of critique of what is being said, or an emphasis on, the actual analysis underpinning what's going on. So it really kind of degrades the conversation. And a lot of times this can also be really harmful to Palestinians. I mean, as we mentioned before, it can be harmful in the sense that Palestinians in the global north and the west can often find themselves in NGOs being used as figureheads or being used as the Palestinian friend, also having signed up for that position in many cases where they get to dictate or are dictated to and then approve what is going to happen, what's going to be the strategy, what is the language, without any real connection to the historical analysis of what has happened in Palestine, common understandings of what's going on in Palestine, or any idea of liberation like we mentioned before. But I think this also happens sometimes in Jewish organizing and anti-Zionist or Zionist, whatever you want to call it, Jewish organizing around Palestine, where the emphasis is placed on the identity of the Jewish organizers. And we've seen this in the last few months, where I've seen posts that say things like Jews call for ceasefire, but things that emphasize identity over content, where it's not about really even the victims of the genocide. Not in Our Name is another one, Leila, which sometimes makes me wonder, okay, I'm sitting here in Palestine and I'm familiar with the phrase not in our name, but sometimes it feels a bit like, well, if it wasn't someone else's name, the emphasis on identity over content, I would say, is how I see identity politics, speaking for myself. And I think it really can be disruptive to organizing in these really important ways. And I'll just give a quick example. When we started with the Defund Racism campaign, and we had connections to different organizations, NGOs in the United States, it was our first time kind of doing some of these collaborations. And there was a very clear agreement in Palestine that it was important that the analysis around the Defund Racism campaign was a settler colonial analysis, not just an occupation, human rights law analysis. I think for a lot of U.S.-based organizations, and obviously, of course, this is pre-October 7th, where there's been, now there's been, I think, a lot more conversation around Zionism. And I think folks it's going to be interesting to see how they deal with that. But a lot of folks were outright refused to engage in this framework in favor of maintaining their two-state solution, international human rights law, humanitarian law framework, which is ahistorical and doesn't represent the situation, and frankly doesn't even represent the work of these settler organizations, which carry out the same tactics on both sides of the Green Line. But some also were unwilling to engage in the campaign as well, because they were afraid that this work of targeting settler organizations' charity status would ultimately harm their own status. So sorry, this has now gone off identity politics a bit, but I think it's important because actually I think it relates quite nicely because it kind of shows this really tense relationship between the identity of a person. A person can be perfectly Palestinian, but if they don't have this decolonial analysis and this idea of liberation moving forward, then of course it's going to be really hard to think about, well, what if I'm sacrificing my paycheck to make this rhetorical decision, Or, yeah, I think that's probably the best way I can put it. Leila, did you want to add anything about identity politics or anything?
I would add one more thing. I'd also say that, we've had a specific case where our ask for organizers in the US was to, target the Attorney General in New York, Letitia James at that time. And she was, a person of color. She was a Black person. So one of the things that organizers were afraid of, despite her, Zionist connections and all of that, and despite, criticisms of all of that, they were worried that, this is a targeting of a Black person. And I think this kind of explained to us the depth of identity politics in the US, that we could not dare say anything against someone because of their identity, even if they are a participant in a process that is violent, that is, oppressive, that is genocidal. So, when we had that issue, I think it became apparent for us how identity politics plays, because, we've seen in all of these UN Security Council, vetoed resolutions against really a ceasefire, a really ask for, for Palestinians to make, to stop, genocide, and then vetoing it, the people who are vetoing it. Do we have to mention the fact that they weren't, white? Can we say the fact that they, they've betrayed this, they've also sold out, they've, absolutely forgotten the fact that they're oppressed, that, themselves in those systems. They forgot completely the concept of solidarity and they became complicit themselves. But there's this fear, ingrained in those spaces about identity that prohibits them from moving forward. And at this stage, what we're asking people to do is to be brave against those thinking and tropes. I would even like to say those are tropes for me, as far as I can say. So I do hope that people and more organizations can stop this nonsense of identity politics and move into serious anti-colonial, decolonial, anti-imperialist organizing.
Yeah. And I just want to clarify for folks listening to understand the perspective of the people who have asked me to have more dialogue on this. It's that the term identity politics, if you trace its origin, comes from Black feminists, socialists, and communists combined. There was a few different tendencies within the group, but their use of the term was to say that as people who experience racial, capitalist, and patriarchal oppression, that we have a right to develop our own politics based off of an analysis of those multiple forms of oppression. And, Barbara Smith, who's one of the co-authors of that, would say, that's all we meant by it. We didn't mean that as Black people that we're the only people who can analyze racism, or that we're the only people who could analyze capitalism, or that we have some special analysis of patriarchy that other people can't take up. And so what's interesting is that the way that the term has been morphed a lot over time, Barbara Smith would say, I don't recognize it. It doesn't have anything to do with what we were talking about. And I think that that's the trickiness around that specific term. So I've had people say, use identitarian rather than saying identity politics, because of the way that those two concepts can become conflated. And also I've had people say use neoliberal identity politics. But either way, I mean, I totally understand what you all are talking about, and I'm not at all dismissing the phenomenon that you're addressing, because I think everybody can see it's very real. Perhaps like a particularly egregious example from my perspective was just, I don't know whether it was this week or last week, when, some protesters disrupted Biden's speech at the AME church. And this was condemned by a bunch of what I would call comprador elite, Black, people within the political class as anti-Black, not solidaristic, blah, 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 blah. Of course, that's insane because there's actually a genocide going on and there's actually the person who's responsible for it. And if anything, we should be questioning why anyone would want to be sitting in front of a speech given by Joe Biden right now, regardless of what their identity is, as he's enacting genocide, unless it is to protest him or to, scream at him or make him uncomfortable in some way. And so I absolutely agree, too, in terms of like the widespread and the danger of this phenomenon and the inability that people feel to critique people because, they represent some population of people that is historically oppressed in one way or another. So, yeah, I think it's an important phenomenon. And I think it's unfortunate from my perspective. Some people, I think that also, and I'll just leave space for this and we don't need to go into it, but I think some people think that the Combahee River Collective's statement itself leaves open these expansions, I think, into what we would call as a more negative identity politics. I'm not sure that I agree with that assessment, but because on some level I would say there's part of what the Combahee River Collective statement is saying that is similar to what you all are saying in terms of Palestinians have a right in their own liberation movements to define their own politics and their own future, right? And so that's where it gets tricky, because I think that that's true within a movement and within a motion of history for a group of people and for a liberatory, movement. It's not necessarily true for an individual to just say, because I am this, then everything that I say politically is valid. Yeah.
This is such a good pointer because, like, you just basically said that there's a misreading of identity politics. And as we talked throughout this podcast, that there's a misreading of decolonization, there's a misreading of anti-Zionism. So we can see how, this, misreadings constantly of this idea of, identity politics as I am this and I the only person that decides to do that, and that the content itself is not important. And I think this is exactly, I think, the wording, I think, would have been probably better with neoliberal identity politics, because the neoliberal aspect is the most prominent one. And I think it's correct to call it that. And I think that's as close as we want it to be with our understanding of neoliberal identity politics.
Yeah, right on. And it's not I would say it's not a criticism of you all, because I think like that term, especially if you move into different contexts, like in the UK, they don't have the history, for instance, with the Combahee River Collective, in Palestine, and so like that is a very specific thing. And I think partly one of the things is we've done a lot of work over the years with Black liberation movements and Black studies. So a lot of people who operate in those histories listen to our podcast and they'll say like, yeah, but the people who came up with that term, that's not what they meant by it, right? And so anyway, yeah, it's the same thing, right? As you're saying with decolonization, it's not, the way that it gets weaponized and used is not actually what was originally intended. And I mean, thinking with like Olufemi Taiwo and like elite capture, like he would say, unfortunately, just by arguing over words, we're not going to win out, because these terms, once they get co-opted by powers that are forceful enough, like we don't have the means to out-debate mainstream society. But I do still think that there's an importance within our movements to kind of draw people back to some of those origins as well, and think about the political content of the ideas and how those have been hollowed out, and that we need to get back to at least thinking with the more radical political content of where those ideas come from. So lastly, your piece offers some things to look out for in organizations. One of my comrades, Brooke, shout out to Brooke, calls this a smell test of a good or a bad organization. He and some comrades have put some work in over the years of trying to develop like the elements of their smell tests. But what are some things that you think should be a part of an anti-Zionist smell test?
I really like this question because I love the idea of a smell test, but I think it's so true that there are just some things that people say and do that immediately set you off to kind of wonder, oh, what's underneath that? And so I think we start to name a few of those things by kind of suggesting what people shouldn't do in the piece. And one is the one that Leila mentioned earlier of calling it Israel-Palestine or Palestine-Israel. And they think that's one that's really grating for a lot of Palestinians, when you have people who claim to be anti-Zionist allies and then continuously refer to it as Israel-Palestine, because it really, that's already a form of erasure. But I think another really important one is that we've seen a lot lately, as there's been more conversation around Zionism and anti-Zionism, especially in what anti-Zionism is. And there's also been a proliferation of organizations calling themselves anti-Zionist, which I think is kind of exciting. And then organizations that were already using that label, using it more. But I think more we're seeing folks try to name what that means and try to read and examine. And we always recommend that folks go and read, Palestinian decolonial analysis about this. But I think that's another big one, is sort of just this blanket use of anti-Zionist without any kind of critical analysis of what this means. And then another one, and I'll also let Leila answer because I'm sure Leila has things, but another one that I really wanted to say is collaboration, especially when we're talking about organizations. A lot can be garnered from who organizations are willing to work with. And so in the last months, we've seen, I'll say it. We've seen JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace, which is an organization that calls itself anti-Zionist, has done so for a few years, work with, if not now, very, very publicly, and also almost exclusively on the national level, I don't think with anyone else, and if not now, is explicitly not an anti-Zionist organization. And even if they called themselves an anti-Zionist organization, we know they're not. Being in Palestine, we know who they collaborate with, and they collaborate here with organizations that are Zionists, that bring, Jewish foreigners here and engage in normalization. And so I think this is really problematic, and it's something that folks have to examine a lot. And it doesn't mean that people who have done that are irredeemable, but it does mean that it requires more thought and accountability. And it requires that the people who are engaged in doing that don't just take terms like anti-Zionist and decolonization and use them to protect themselves, rather than accept critique from Palestinians and other anti-Zionists who are, really trying to create something and think about, what does working towards liberation really look like, and what does it mean, and what are the principles of that? And I think that for a long time, that's been a really big problem. The problem of accountability, which goes back to this neoliberal identity politics. I'm so glad you said that. Yeah, and really sidelines meaningful critiques that could be taken in good faith and really be used to create something different.
Yeah, I think one would be, people who work exclusively with kind of, lobbying politicians, Congress and whatnot. I find this a bit like an attempt to kind of professionalize the struggle. The reason why I feel this is problematic is because right now, more than ever, building of mass movements and mobilization is important. And for people that feel like they have some sort of ownership over projects or the struggle, because they've created some sort of, for them, top-level intervention, they often can be disruptive to real possible change. And I see that right now, and as we see, with protests globally about, the genocide in Gaza, is that the kind of mass movement element was really like strong, and we should keep continuing at that. We should keep continuing at building the movement as opposed to sort of, fragmenting the movement. And we've seen how, some organizations, try to take ownership over, projects and campaigns, and as if, the campaigns are not about something tangible for Palestine, but about that we did it and not you. And it just sounds very, in fact, unprofessional, but also, that's not what Palestinians want when we consider struggling for Palestine. It takes more than that, it takes a bit more of a sacrifice. If you're doing something and you're doing it comfortably for Palestine, then it's probably ineffective because it's not really targeting the proper, targets that should be targeted. And I think a reassessment of that is needed. I think the second one is those organizations as well that I feel like they often only talk about what is possible, what is pragmatic, what can be possible for Palestine. So, and I think that is it's an alarm. It's a very, very huge alarm because, Palestinians and, when Palestinian resistance emerged out of absolute hopelessness, even, like when we had no means of resistance, no power, no tools of resistance, still emerged. The idea was never about the fact that this resistance is going to be ultimately, and at that moment, the moment of liberation. It's a process. It's about understanding that, Palestinians are not seeking what is possible. Palestinians are seeking liberation. And if the, outside organizations and these different organizations see that as futile, then be it. But for Palestinians, this is what we're doing right now. And this is our ultimate say that we don't seek what is possible. Because if we seek what is possible, then we would have only accepted what we have right now. But this is not something that Palestinians are capable of doing. And this is something that they have to understand. That, if you're limited by international law and these different human rights paradigms, that you need to rethink that decolonization does not work with that. There might be an often contradiction between those human rights and international law paradigm and what resistance does and what Palestinians want and what, all of these groups are acting and doing. So, you shouldn't be naming those out. You should sit comfortably with that. If you feel uncomfortable with the fact that Palestinians are, committing acts of decolonization, then sit with it. Comfortable with it. I think that's one of the things that we want these organizations to feel, and we want them to think seriously and reconsider. The last thing I would say is really the one that bothers me the most is the people that are still hung up on the two-state solution. And we've seen these people with now less so, and now they're moving in towards this idea of one state. And I've heard this argument of this, one state, doesn't matter what it's called, but it's one state where everybody is equal. And these people often also end up in the same level with those organizers that only talk about apartheid. So they call it only apartheid. They don't recognize settler colonialism, or they recognize apartheid. So their argument is that the solution is equality only, and not a right of return, and not land and land back and whatnot. So I think these are the kind of things that we hope people, are capable of reassessing. And mostly, I think just to reiterate the accountability one, is that when Palestinians come up to these organizations and ask them and request for them to rethink their understanding of anti-Zionism and to also hold them accountable, this doesn't mean that those organizations are incapable of change. Every organization is capable of change. We rest on the hope that these organizations would learn. And we're seeing some happen. We're seeing some of these kind of changes happen with the language, with people, saying, 75 years. We've heard this idea of, people saying, 50 years instead because of the, 1967 borders. So we want to see more of that. We can see that there is more courage right now because, ultimately, it's all open. It's an open book what's happening in Palestine, and it's an open book and it's only right for them. It's only moral for them. It's more of a moral question than it is anything else.
Beautiful. Thank you. I realize we've covered a lot of ground. Appreciate you both for your time. I don't know if there's anything that either of you or both of you would like to say in closing, perhaps a little bit more about the work of the Good Shepherd Collective, but whatever you would like to say in closing.
Well, I guess I just want to say thank you, Jared. And maybe I will just tell folks about the way Good Shepherd Collective funds our work, if that's okay, because I think it's a little bit unique. Well, it's definitely unique. So we talked a little bit in the beginning about how large donor institutions usually have these restrictions and sort of like principles about, I don't want to say principles, I want to say restrictions about the way that organizations have to function in order to receive their donations. And so in large part because of that, and because of some of our other founding members who have experience in fundraising, we have never gone that route, and GSC functions almost entirely through individual donations. So that's what we've done over the last, I'm trying to think, 6 years almost. And that's what we continue to do today. So small donations. So if folks are interested in that, they can go to our website. But I think it's just important that folks know that about us as well, because it really is something important that allows us to be able to do our work on terms that we think are just and right and go by our analysis and the analysis of our Palestinian partners who we are accountable to, rather than large donors who don't live in Palestine, who don't have this analysis, and who, aren't accountable to the people here. And thank you so much. This was really such a fun conversation, and I've watched some of your lives on YouTube, so it feels like I know you already. I'm sure you don't feel, well, there's no way you've never seen me before, but no, it's just really cool because some people that I really admire have been interviewed by you, and I really admire your interviewing, and I love these questions. So thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you
so much, Jared. Really appreciate the invite. I think it was also like a learning as well, a moment for us. I think with me also listening to the past few podcasts that you've done, specifically the ones with Abdul Jawad, who's also been a close friend of mine. In fact, I was always inspired by the fact that you allow and give space to people that don't have the kind of a more soft, moderate line, because often what happens is, people get comfortable with that moderate line, or people are afraid to say things, more, courageously. So I really appreciate that you continuously invite people to speak their truths. And I appreciate that you've chosen us as well to interview and talk today. Hopefully we'll have more, interactions in the future. And I hope all the listeners as well enjoyed the talk today. We've learned ourselves as well. We're continuously learning. We're continuously unlearning as well. So thanks for that, Jared.
Definitely appreciate talking to you both. Learned a lot from both of you and from the piece, and would love to work with you again. And I'll just say, as far as our guests, amazing folks agree to talk to me, and I'm not quite sure why. So I don't take too much credit for that, but I, am humbled and appreciate all the wonderful folks who have joined us on our platform to share their knowledge with us. And one thing about Joshua or I is neither of us is that interested in the moderate or the pragmatic, or people who are, too uncomfortable feel like they can't say certain things. And so, that's probably true. But thank you.